We have an update in a case of a teenage girl accused of orchestrating the murder of her boyfriend in South Carolina. 9 teenagers in total are charged with murder in this case, and the youngest suspect just 15 years old. Now prosecutors are making it clear they want everyone who's charged in this case tried as an adult.
As soon as I came out the doors, he was already lying in the middle of the road. My dad was over top of him. He wasn't really performing CPR because he had seen that Trey got shot kind of where his lungs were.
This is a case of a teenager who had his entire life ahead of him, who died alongside one of his closest friends. We'll also talk about the state law that could make all 9 people charged in this case as guilty as the man who allegedly pulled the trigger. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Stewart. Hey, before we start this episode of On the Case, I do need to talk about our partner and sponsor for this episode, Upside. It's a free app that gives you cash back when you buy daily essentials like gas and groceries. I often use it when I pump gas or go to 7-Eleven, maybe stop by Taco Bell. And what we're talking about is real cash back. So after you spend money, it will appear in your Upside account. Then you can transfer it straight to your bank. So here's what you do. Download the Upside app for free, buy whatever you plan to purchase, pay as you typically would with your credit or debit card, then you file a claim in the app, and then you get money right back to you. So to find out how much you could save with Upside, click the link in the description or scan the QR code on our screen and use promo code OTC to get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Now you would hope that in a group of friends, if there was the possibility that one of them was going to harm someone, that there would be a person who would be the voice to step in and stop it. That someone would speak up in a group of 9 people. But that didn't allegedly happen in the case of Trey Wright in South Carolina. And not only did everyone allegedly stay quiet, the person who was closest to him, his own girlfriend, is accused of being the one who orchestrated the situation that led to his murder. Now, these are the mugshots of 7 of the 9 people who are facing charges in the death of Trey Wright. He was killed on the night of June 24th. These 7 people, they are all facing a charge of murder, and their cases are in adult court. But there are 2 other suspects. We don't know their names. We don't have their mugshots because they're juveniles. But according to WPDE-TV, the 15 and 16-year-old, well, they may be charged as adults, but it's not just as simple as putting them in adult court. We'll talk a little bit about what prosecutors are trying to do, though, to make that happen. Now, before we get into that, I want to talk about Trey Wright, who's the victim in this story. He was just 16 years old when he was shot and killed on June 24th. It was that night around 11:30 that deputies responded to find him shot along a country road in South Carolina. Now, as far as the suspects go in this case, this is the man who police say pulled the trigger. His name, Devin Raper. He was 19 years old when this allegedly happened. Raper and Wright, they followed each other on social media, and a close family friend told me that Trey actually considered Devin Raper a friend. They used to hang out and go to truck shows in Myrtle Beach, she said. She says that they didn't know each other for a long time, but they hung out. Detectives say the night of Trey's murder, though, they were at odds. And they were at odds over a girl the night that Wright was killed. Now that girl is also charged with murder. In fact, she's accused of orchestrating what happened to her boyfriend, Trey Wright. Her name is Gianna Kistenmacher. Trey's friend told me that she remained on scene the night after Trey was shot and deputies arrived, but she did find something suspicious about how Kistenmacher allegedly acted. Had you ever met Gianna?
That night was the first time I'd ever met her.
And again, I know there's things that you can say and you can't say. I mean, but she was still on scene. I guess like you saw her there when you went outside.
Yes, sir. She was still on scene. She stayed on scene till he went to the hospital, and then she went to the hospital. But his mom and them didn't know anything till I got there, or the other kids got there to let her know what was going on, because I wasn't the person who could tell her that on the phone, and I was the one who called.
Now, detectives have cast a wide net in this case investigating Trey's murder because you have 9 teenagers who are facing charges of murder, but only one of them is accused of being the person who fired the gun. Now, the other suspects in this case are 18-year-old Hunter Kendall, 17-year-old Sydney Kearns, and 18-year-old Corinne Belviso. Detectives say they brought Raper to the scene that night knowing that Devin Raper was armed and knowing that there was going to be a confrontation with the victim, Trey Wright. Now, the other suspects that we know about, 17-year-old Braylon Thompson and 17-year-old Jaden O'Clair, both were granted $20,000 bonds, and court records show that they posted bond on the same day, and that day was August 6th. And this is where this story gets even more shocking and frankly sad, because this is a picture that we found of a Snapchat post allegedly made by Thompson of him and O'Clair outside the Florence County Detention Center, and it shows the two of them posing. O'Clair's like throwing up a peace sign. Thompson has a finger in his mouth, showing his teeth like he's wearing a grill. The caption to that post, quote, "I'm free," with a racial slur. Can't say that racial slur here, nor would I want to, but I'll tell you it's a racial slur that begins with the letter N. Now, I reached out to the Florence County Sheriff just to see if they were aware of this post, and they told me that they were aware. It's also unclear what led to Thompson and O'Clair's charges at the time of this recording. So that brings the number to 7 suspects. And then the final 2, in the eyes of the law, they're juveniles as of right now because they're 15 and 16 years old, but all of that could change. I have a new 10-page police report that sheds light on what detectives say happened on the night Trey Wright was killed. And I want to dive into that before we talk about what could happen to those juvenile suspects. So it was around 11:40, 11:41 that night that law enforcement responded to the call about a shooting. The deputy said the scene, it was chaotic. You had people screaming after this gunshot was fired, and Trey Wright was on the ground. People were distraught. They were emotional, according to deputies. Trey, he was on the ground fighting for his life. Several people were around him screaming. He had 2 close gunshot wounds to his chest. EMS had rushed him to the hospital, but that's where he lost his life. Deputies say they were told the shooter fled in a white Mazda SUV. 4 people were inside, according to deputies. One of them had a gun, and one of them was wearing a ski mask, according to police. Now, deputies say when the car first arrived, Trey Wright approached it. He banged on the door. Someone opened the door, and that's when the shots were fired. The deputy also writes that the confrontation was planned and fueled by provocative Snapchat messages. Law enforcement also say there are recordings of this incident on some of the suspects' phones. We have not seen those recordings as of yet. Now, even though all the suspects are facing a very serious charge of murder, Devin Raper is still being held in jail. All the others have posted bond. That includes the 2 youngest suspects, 15 and 16 years old.
I did not do none of this. There was 4 more people.
All right, I'm not here to try.
I understand that. But
I'm not here to try your case, but you can speak to law enforcement, and you can also talk to your attorney.
They won't talk. They didn't do nothing.
Now, what you just saw there was Devin Raper at his first court appearance where he tried to argue his case to the judge. That video per WBTW. Now, as far as the 8th and 9th suspects, they are juveniles at this point. That's where their case is, in juvenile court. We don't know their names because they're so young, but all of that could change because the prosecutor in this case recently told WPDE-TV that he is pushing for the 15 and 16-year-olds to be charged as adults. At least one of them is a girl. Now, the station says that both teens are in the custody of their parents right now, and they will need to go through mental health evaluations to determine whether or not they, like the others in this case, will be tried as adults. Joining us once again to talk about this case from South Carolina is Tyler Bailey, criminal defense attorney and civil rights attorney. Great as always to talk with you here on Law and Crime, because there's always been, there always is with this case, some interesting, I guess, legal dynamics to it as we move forward. What would it take for the 2 suspects, we don't know their names at this point, a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old, to be tried in adult court as opposed to juvenile court in this case?
Yeah, well, first, it's always great being on. And in this case, you have these 2 juveniles. And in juvenile proceedings in South Carolina for criminal cases, they're handled in family court. And, the max detainment for a juvenile is till they reach the age of 21, or the majority to get out of juvenile proceedings. If they're tried as adults, then they could be penalized just like a regular adult could. This, with murder here, it could be a life sentence. There's some constitutional protections there that will prevent the death penalty or them being subject to life without parole. But even before they get there, the prosecutor has discretion whether to try to have them waived up to be tried as an adult. And when that's done, there's a mental health evaluation, which is a pre-waiver evaluation that looks into their mental health, psychological issues possibly, and also there's just family background, social background, and really trying to figure out if they had the capacity to really understand what they were doing, because young folks' brains mature, take longer to mature, and there's some limitations on understanding future consequences of actions of minors, and the proceedings are meant to see if the juvenile system can rehabilitate them or if they need to be tried as adults so they are punished versus being rehabilitated.
They're clearly facing very serious charges. I mean, a charge of murder, and we'll dive into why, even though they aren't the ones who are accused of pulling the trigger, that they're still facing that charge. What typically is the cutoff, though? Because I feel like in some cases you'll see someone who's 17 years old, they're not 18, and they're tried as an adult, even 16, but 15 feels very young. What's typically the cutoff in South Carolina for cases age-wise to be moved into adult court?
Great question, and there's no cutoff. There's discretion of the prosecutor. So there's situations where you've had children as young as 12, 13 years old involved in gun crime here who have had pre-waiver hearings to see if they could be tried as an adult. And it's more so, it looks there's a lot of categories they look into. The nature of the crime. Was this a crime against property? Was it a crime or a crime against a person, like a murder here? And so the prosecutor looks into all that and some of the background of what happened to see if this is something that requires, or justice requires, a minor being tried as an adult. So there is no cutoff. The way our law works here is the prosecutor has discretion, and protections are the pre-waiver evaluation that these young kids here are going through.
What could a defense attorney for either of these juveniles do if they wanted to try and keep this in juvenile court?
Well, the pre-waiver hearing is really the protection, and they could try to have their own independent hearing or pre-waiver hearing for the minors done, because generally DSS psychologists or psychiatrists, they're the ones who would do this pre-waiver evaluation. And if there's some discrepancies there, or if the family and the defense lawyer wants to pay the cost for their own independent evaluation to be done, so it could be brought to the discretion of the judge to point out some issues that may be flaws inside the state's evaluation, to give the judge another perspective at it. That's the most that could be done. And they can make arguments based off of things that come out in the report, based off the family background, the social background of the minor. I mean, for example, if a child had a real traumatic past, they're abused as a child, they've had some psychological issues, maybe they could be on the spectrum or things of that nature, and the prosecutor is still seeking to have them tried as an adult. Those are things that the defense lawyer should bring to the attention of the court, so the court can make a decision whether this should happen, of them being tried as an adult, or is it more appropriate for them to stay in family court for juvenile proceedings.
And if a prosecutor, like in this case, says that he wants this to be an adult court, I mean, what's the success rate of a prosecutor in these cases, even if a defense brings up some evidence of actually getting it into adult court?
It really, it should be that this is based off of, objective evidence in the evaluation that's done for the minors. And a lot of times when you have a heinous crime, you have ages that are closer to the age of majority, 16, 17, a murder, or for example, or signs of no remorse, signs of, malice and forethought, along with some intentional acts to try to conceal evidence of the crime afterwards, along with a evaluation that seems fair that the minors be tried as adult. Those are usually stronger cases where they are tried as adults. And then you judges are also influenced by public pressure. What is the public saying? What's the outcry here? I mean, this situation was a tragic situation. You've got 9 young teenagers essentially involved in a murder of I believe a 16-year-old. And there was video recordings of this, and youth violence is a problem in South Carolina, but also throughout the country. And so you have the elected prosecutor here, and the assistant solicitors working there, or deputy prosecutors, are trying to send a message here, and they think it's appropriate for these 2 minors to be tried as an adult. And this could be one of those cases where they ultimately are tried as adults.
And before we get back to this case, I mean, the part of it about how there is allegedly video recordings of this, and the youth violence issue is so real in so many parts of the country. Just for you, and I know, and we often talk about some really difficult cases. Just what has stood out to you about this case and how you have 9 people who I just think there could have been someone along the way that could have spoken up and stopped this from happening, and to have 9 people who allegedly did not is just, it's sad, and it's sad to see a loss of life.
Yeah, what sticks out to me is the mob-like culture of this. When I say mob, it's not, organized crime type of setting, but more so of a all jumping in on the situation, because you have young people who drove there, who video recorded it, and almost showed a little disregard for the seriousness of what they're being involved in. I mean, this is real life. These are firearms that aren't toys. You have a child, a kid who is murdered, and I think that's why you see some things that are common taking place in this case, like people who did not actually participate in pulling the trigger being charged with murder, not being accessories before the fact or accessory after the fact. You got the actual young people here being charged with murder, 9 people being charged with murder when there's only 1 shooter, and that's deliberate on the part of the prosecution to try to send that message, I believe, that this is something that people or the state does not think should take place at all, and they could be charged with accessories before or after the fact, but they said they're going to try them under the hands of one, hands of all theory in regards to a murder, which is not normal in juvenile proceedings, and certainly not even normal in regular cases involving adults in most situations.
If you can walk us through hands of one, hands for all, and how that works, because Devin Raper is the only person who is accused of firing the bullets that took Trey Wright's life. Everyone else, they knew that there was going to be a confrontation and that Devin Raper was armed, and just knowing that is why they're facing a charge of murder. How does that work in South Carolina, that all these people could be facing that charge of murder?
Generally, when there's a hands of one, hands of all in cases, it's like when young kids are riding around and one of them has a legal firearm, officer pulls them over and finds the gun in there. He says, whose gun is this? Nobody claims it, so they're all charged with the actual crime. And in this situation here, you're having that being applied to an overt intentional act, which is a murder, where you need malice and forethought. And so essentially what they're saying, rather than this being like possession of drugs or possession of a firearm, it is all of them acted with the malice and forethought to commit this murder. And they believe there are sufficient probable cause, not there just for them to be accused of this, but ultimately the state believes by charging them all for murder that they can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. I think that is the biggest caveat here. If the defense lawyers can take an aggressive approach showing that the state can't meet their burden, that they really all acted with the malice and forethought necessary to be charged with murder. It's going to be an interesting case, and I highly doubt the prosecutors just use this as leverage. I'm interested to see how this ultimately ends and what that means for other cases, not just in South Carolina, but if you're going to see this strategy being used in violent crime across the country.
When it comes to how the court would view, say, the charge of someone who was, these two are going to get into a conflict, there's a gun involved, maybe a person who took a video of this confrontation, compared to Devin Raper, if he goes on trial and he's accused of pulling the trigger, under this, is there any difference in the way that the court views that charge that the person is facing in this case?
No, I mean, there really won't be. So the biggest difference will be the consequence that the juveniles can that can be imposed on them if they're convicted. So if it remains in juvenile proceedings, if they're convicted for murder or they pled guilty to murder, they still will only be detained until the age of 21. So contrary to that, if they are waived up, and this is held in general sessions, which is felony criminal court, and somebody who, let's say, just video recorded the situation, possibly was there when they drove there and when they left, and they are actually convicted of murder, then they could be subject to a prison term of 20 years or life with the eligibility of parole. So it's really all about the consequences. And if a jury finds that the elements of the crime are met, the sentencing will be up to the judge. Now, I do think the judge will take into consideration their age, what their role was, and probably would impose a appropriate sentence thinking about those things. But technically, by law, they could get the maximum penalty that could be imposed, which could be a term of life, but with the eligibility of parole.
If for a defense attorney who's going to be representing one of these kids in adult court, and say it is that person who was aware potentially that there was going to be this conflict, maybe even they recorded a video, and this is kind of more just generalizing of what a defense could be, like how could a criminal defense attorney handle this case knowing that that you haven't seen this type of murder charge be applied to people in situations like this compared to other cases in the past?
Two approaches a defense lawyer could take, I believe, will be one, immediately using some mitigation to get a favorable plea deal. That's one option and one road you can go down. Or two, saying this is something bigger, making this case about the state trying to, really overcharge here in situations where this is maybe things that are going on outside of the realms of this case, and they're trying to send a message, trying to really appease the public versus doing what is just here, and that the facts don't add up to what they're being accused of, showing that they had no, gunshot residue on them. They never had possession of the gun. They were just there. They just recorded it. Was it dumb? Yes, but does that mean that they had malice and forethought and they wanted this young, tragic child to lose her life? No, I think could be a convincing argument for a defense lawyer to make, which would maybe easier to get an acquittal versus something like being accessory before the fact or after the fact. That's more open and shut. But when somebody is being overcharged, there are a lot of reasons that a jury could find some reason to acquit, especially when you're dealing with young people and just the parental aspect of some jurors who may think, these kids deserve another chance, and the prosecution is overcharging these kids here, and they could have found something else to charge them with, which would have done them justice if they weren't the actual shooter.
I also think if every single person who is charged in this case takes this to trial, to have 9 separate murder trials related to this case, how could one case impact another? Like if the first person who goes, who's not Devin Raper, who's accused of shooting, and they're the ones who's just kind of charged as this person who was aware it was going to happen, and let's just say they're found not guilty, how could that impact the other cases where people are facing similar accusations?
I think immediately that gives those defense lawyers some leverage to talk to the prosecution about maybe something more favorable for these young folks, maybe something more appropriate with them receiving probation versus actually being tried for murder. I mean, trying 9 individual cases for murder after going through possibly more waiver hearings to see if they can be tried as adults. These are costly proceedings for the state. And if one is acquitted early, who may have acted with more, culpability, being more involved, and they're acquitted, it immediately shows some flaws in the state's whole, thought process in charging these kids with murder. Now, contrary to that, if somebody who had less involvement is convicted of murder pretty quickly, then immediately I think that changes everything for all the other individuals, where they probably may end up pleading guilty to something that's on the stiffer end. And the good thing, not the good thing, but the thing that is important for people to think is that they are the ones who are still being charged in juvenile proceedings, even if they pled guilty, would not be in jail for their entire life. And the criminal justice system is supposed to consider more than just punishment. You got to think of rehabilitation. And if they're based off their mental status of these young people, if they can be rehabilitated and have some appropriate consequence, that's really what the prosecutor's aim should be, not sending some public message just to appease the public's desire to see young people stop the violent crime, and also for there to be some severe punishment when something less could be more appropriate.
Yeah, and we'll see how this story plays out. Still a lot of ways to go. Tyler Bailey, criminal defense attorney, civil rights attorney, thank you as always for taking the time to be with us on Law&Crime. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law&Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.